So you go to a country like we had in Benin, whereby the laws were very clear and nobody was respecting the laws. They had to create another agency to support the implementation of those policies. We have that in different countries at different degrees. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Juliet, any other go to this? Am I missing any hand? Any other input to this? I have a full screen here. I don't see anyone else. Paddy, do you see any hand up from your side? I don't see any here from my side.
No hand from my side. But probably I thought it would, as maybe one more person is digesting. It's a very interesting perception that has been shared, perspective that has been shared, I think, in terms of the African Charter. And I wonder, Juliet, I don't think we got an introduction from you, but I wonder also, not to put you on the spot, but in terms of what you think is needed, for us to move forward with it, where the push is sitting. Because even for example, within the African Union, I think it would be important to know, and this is one of the things we talked about, who are we actually engaging with? But also at the national level, where does this charter really sit? With who? Should we be looking at, entities that are in charge of, public sector largely, or should we be going to those that are in charge of, ministries of local government or local government commissions, for that matter? Is it cabinet secretary? So, where should we be going? Is it parliament? So just got to come in there, Chair, with your permission, for Juliet's response.
Can I say something about that?
Sure, Juliet.
Okay, now, yes. Okay, in fact, it is a ministry in charge of local governments or in charge of decentralization and local governments that can do anything. We, as the Local Government Association, to push, that is to take the charter to their ministry, and it is the minister that has to, present it. Then take the minister in charge of local government to take it to the minister in charge of foreign affairs. Then they'll look at it and take it to Parliament for ratification. It can be signed, but it needs to be ratified at the country level. And until it is ratified, we will not consider the country as having done anything. So the minister in charge of local government picks it up, takes it to the minister in charge of finance. It varies. Different countries have their different legislation about this ratification of those international conventions. So generally, I'm giving you the general trend. That's how it works. So then they'll send it to Parliament for ratification. That said, I want to talk about the African Union. We have a committee in charge of public service and whatever public service, something. But decentralization is that about 8. They call it Special Technical Commission number 8 at the African Union. So they are in charge of decentralization. So anything decentralization, ensuring that the policy is making progress in every country, they are in charge. So yeah, they know that we've worked on this charter, visiting different countries, trying to ensure that the country signs and ratifies it. But each time you want to go back to the STC number 8 to find out, to say, oh, there's no budget or something like that. So it becomes a little bit of a challenge to ensure that countries are aware of what it is and they can sign and ratify it. So I hope I've answered the question.
Sure. Maybe.
I just wanted to introduce myself. Because she mentioned that. My name is Dr. Juliet Saleh. My name is Dr. Juliet Saleh. I'm Regional Director for West Africa at the United States and Local Government of Africa. My office is based in Accra, Ghana.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Juliet. Maybe we can have that as the last, so that we can go to the last slide that you promised to give us, Paddy, to allow us to also move to the next session.
Absolutely. And so I think that on that, it's a good segue as I open my screen so that you're able to see. It's a good segue for us to talk about what we thought was sort of the key outcome of the session. And a major outcome. I mean, there was a lot around what we could do better. But then there was a lot about where do we do it better? And what came out in terms of was this talk about this space for community of practice, a space where we can have knowledge sharing, so some kind of a knowledge hub. Where do we take all the different research that are being done, so a repository of research, but also where are people meeting so that they engage, so this engagement ecosystem for the experts and leaders, because we had a lot of talk around influencers. Where do we bring, for instance, mayors that we can see have are striving and navigating a very challenging path in terms of decentralization and what the role they play, and other actors indeed, what role they could play. So what space would that be? And we coined it the Pan-African Decentralization Platform, PANDA. And PANDA in Swahili, actually, I was just thinking about this, Judy, means to walk, to move. Because then when I looked at it, thinking about Chinese references, a panda we would think about is the bear. But in the African context, I thought that it was interesting that it means to walk and to move in Swahili. To panda is basically to maybe stamp on it, even more than walking. So just as a side note, but why would that be important to have a Pan-African decentralization platform? Because we need a space in which these kind of engagements are happening. But we also thought, well and good to have an idea out there around having a Pan-African decentralization platform. But what do we do then in the meantime for this? One, I think, very critical is that we have made the presentation here in terms of the next steps. We have made the presentation here within the Local Public Sector Alliance, a Sub-Saharan working group that would predominantly really look at what a panda should be, the inspirations, but also many of the things that Juliet has talked about. Where are we missing? Where are we missing the adaptation? What kind of triggers do we need, or where can we touch so that things can begin to move and we can actually begin to see actions? Then also, one of the outcomes, one of the key highlights that had come out was to understand where decentralization started from in each and every location. Some had, rooted also in colonization. So there was a conversation also around decolonizing, but what that actually meant, really, probably more around moving forward. So how do we move forward from the concept around the panda to where it should be? And a suggestion that has been positioned is that we use the Sub-Saharan working group, and indeed some of the thematic working groups of the Local Public Sector Alliance, to sort of host a transit space for this panda. And so hosting the panda would also mean that we continue to engage with actors as we are within this meeting, but there could be a series of other engagements through the knowledge products that are already under the Local Public Sector Alliance that are focusing on the African continent, but also focusing on thematics that touch on the African continent. And there are other co-chairs that would feed into this, but also the Sub-Saharan Working Group and the thematic groups would provide some kind of a structure so we can craft really what are the strategic plans, and also what's that initial program for the panda moving forward, but remaining very conscious of what the focus is. And that focus is to promote decentralization through effective evidence and data governance for effective policymaking. And with that, I think we would invite you to share your reflections on what we have shared today, not just as the outcomes of the workshop, because the workshop indeed is done and there will be a report, but there is a life after the workshop, and we see that life coming out through the Pan-African Decentralization Platform. So your views would be very interesting, and you will see a lot develop out of the working group, so you can become more conversant with it and really be part of that. Chair, I hand over to you. Thank you so much.
Very, very well said, Paddy. And I think that now takes me very slowly to the next session. you've spoken about and underscored the facts around the need for data for evidence. And I think if you look at the full report, for those who have been able to go to our site, we decided to have that as a small topic, a small theme to discuss today on evidence-based policy making and knowledge development. But I would like to combine that actually with the matter around advocacy and outreach, because we're talking about Africa as a continent. And what we need to find a way, and this is actually after the thought around how do we outline in Kiswahili. And looking at that, we just had a few points on which I would like that we try to reflect on. So I'll not spend 20 minutes, but I'll have 5 minutes to share those ideas, and then time for us to chime in as participants. One, when you talk about Panda, to be able to reach out to all of us across Africa, we thought that we could actually begin to think about a platform, and that is what Paddy has alluded to, a platform within which you can have consistent meetings, but also sharing of best practices around data and evidence. And maybe once in a year, come together in a conference or in a meeting or in a workshop to deliberate on this. Of course, with very well-defined themes, looking at the best practices around Africa, but also the challenges. And how do you begin to fix, or how do you begin to address these challenges? And I think if you listen to Dr. Saleh, the matter around decentralization is real. So from the experiences, what can we come up with? And how do you begin to gather data? How do you begin to gather knowledge and the best practices around the world for replication? Number two, are there any other ways in which we think as practitioners in decentralization in this development world, as officers, as leaders, as Pan-Africanists, if I may call it, or I may use that word, do we have issues or specific topics we think we can build on? And if we had to do this, we wanted to think about beginning with an assessment. But how do you go about that? Which countries would you want to pick on that have best practices? Where do we have the major challenges? Remember, the first item Paddy highlighted to us was on contextualization. We have varied systems of decentralization across Africa. So how do we start? Which is the next step we must make when it comes to issues on data, research, evidence to inform policy on decentralization? So I want to open that up to you on that. That's the first question. Number two is on advocacy and outreach. We, in the room in May, thought that we cannot, for example, ignore the African Union. And I think it has been mentioned here evidently that we have not had countries take a keen interest on implementing the African Charter on Decentralization and Localization. How do we move from there? How do we reach out to work, for example, with the African Union? And which are the other regional bodies we can work with? ECOWAS, for example, the East African Community, for example. We have SADC, for example. Or who else should we think about when you want to start this journey? And finally, the principles around local governance always speak also to the institutions that are in charge of local governance. Who are these institutions? Apart from the subnational governments we're talking about, how do we work with these institutions of local governance in order to begin raising our voice, the Pan-African voice on decentralization advocates? How do we move? So I would like to open up for another maybe, again, 7 minutes, because I see time is really moving fast, to hear from us on the next steps. What's our contribution? And Paddy, you can also just help me chime in case of anything. And Jamie. I don't see a hand, so I'm wondering whether it was clear. I was. Do you have any? I see Juliet again, Dr. Juliet. Is that a new hire or is what we had?
Yeah, if no one is speaking, then I don't mind to speak, because this is my bread and butter. I love it so much. I'm so passionate about this concept. So unless no one is speaking, then can you give me the floor? Hello?
Yes, you can go ahead.
Okay. When it comes to assessing the progress we are making in the implementation of the policy of decentralization, I think United Cities and local government has done a lot on that already. And every 3 years, we come back to assess what is happening on the ground. You know, we look at the policies, we look at the laws, and then we look at the way it is being implemented, and then we see where the lapses are. And we look at what the concept is supposed to be and see how their laws are and how they're trying to implement, and then we rate them. Okay, so this work is ongoing, and we do that every 3 years. So next year we're going to have another edition. You know, we're going to have another edition published. But I can look for the link and share it with you, Judy, so that you see. I will also share the countries that have actually signed and ratified the African Charter on Decentralization, Local Governance, and Local Development. I also want to talk about this Sub-Saharan Africa. I don't know how you tempt it and all of that, but when we are going to African Union, or we have to have any conversation with African Union, they always frown at the Sub-Saharan Africa term. That terminology is not African, and they will always remind you that it's not African. So where do you keep the Northern Africa? Because when you talk about Sub-Saharan Africa, it means you've divided Africa, and they say they are not interested in dividing Africa. So when we are going forward or meeting them, or you want to have any conversation with African Union, you should always mention Africa, and avoid mentioning Sub-Saharan Africa, because we always frown on that. So when we have to do, for example, an assessment of the implementation of the policy of decentralization in Africa, you realize that the first category that we always find countries like South Africa, Morocco, Uganda, and I think one other country I've forgotten. There are generally 4 that are making some progress in the implementation of the law. You know, we come up with a few, I think 10 or more notions of that concept, and then we assess it as it is happening in country. So then the next thing I would like to talk about is the entry point. If you have to assess, remember the concept of decentralization is a governmental policy. It is a government that accepts, then they adopt it, then they start implementing it. And the implementation means that they transfer some responsibilities to other tiers of government. So any entry point must be the ministry that is in charge of decentralization and local governance in that country. The last point I want to make is on advocacy. Okay, with the United Cities and Local Government World Organization, we did a lot of work in the recognition of cities and local governments as key stakeholders in development. So a lot of work was done for several years and now we are happy to say that right at the United Nations, as we speak, cities and local governments are in New York for the United Nations General Assembly, and they are speaking and they are listening. Actually, they cut out some time, some days of that agenda to ensure that cities and local governments speak, and the United Nations is listening to them as they speak. So that is a lot that has been achieved in terms of advocacy. So now in the various countries, if we have to involve in advocacy, we perhaps look at the laws, see what is not going on right, and then we push through advocacy to ensure that they respect the laws that they themselves had already adopted. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Quite elaborate, Dr. Juliet. I wonder whether there's any other, but I've been able to pick your points around, especially the critical item on the use of the word Sub-Saharan Africa. I think we note that. I don't know whether, Jim, you have an observation on that. And then, of course, the entry points, and that's a very good point, Juliet. If we have institutions such as ministries that are in charge of local government and decentralization, maybe those could be some of the ones that we consider. And of course, the advocacy bit, and I agree with you. Local governments, currently, for example, in New York, I also know of those who are participating in both UNGA and the Summit for the Future, and they're making their contributions around local governance and strengthening sub-national governments.
Yes.
And of course, the last point on those, the push through advocacy. My question would be, maybe for all of us, can we think about, for example, programs that are ongoing within our institutions, and how can we jump in or collaborate to work together, especially when it comes to issues of advocacy, depending on the unique nature of the countries that we have represented here. Maybe that's a question I can ask. If you can be able to type here, or you can raise your hand, then you can be able to pick up. If there is any other, Jenny, would you like to make a comment on the use of the word SSA, Sub-Saharan Africa, or do we move to the next?
Judy, I see a few hands raised. Maybe we
Yes,
can
can you call out for me? I don't see them here.
Sure.
Technology is failing.
I think Yusuf.
Yeah, Yusuf was.
Yusuf. Yeah, Yusuf has a hand up, and then Sylvia.
Good. Yusuf, then followed by Sylvia, kindly. Is Yusuf here? Kindly proceed. And Sylvia can also jump in after that.
Otherwise, if Yusuf is having an issue, Sylvia, do you want to come in while Yusuf is sorting out the audio? Oh, Yusuf, we can't see your audio. Sylvia, the floor. And I also note that Gertrude in the chat has is not able to raise her hand. So maybe Sylvia, then Gertrude. Lima, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So maybe if Sylvia.
Is Sylvia able to unmute herself, or is there a challenge?
Probably some technical issues, some audio problems.
So do we move to the next? I realize today there's a very big challenge with technology. I don't know why.
Yeah, this is Gertrude, Judy.
Good, Gertrude. Please proceed.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to be on this call and in this meeting to discuss such a very important topical issue. I'd love to really take it away from where my sister Juliet left it. And two points. I would attempt to make a response around the Sub-Saharan name. It depends on how you would pitch or approach the issue. the issue of assessment or engagement with the AU could still remain within that demarcation as presented by the LSPA working group in terms of looking at the decentralization issues in that region and taking entry through the framework of the regional economic blocks that the African Union engages with. That is one. And then there we have the ESC, the SADC, the COMESA, well covered, where we would really build a platform of amplification of the role and the legitimacy of local government business stemming from the government policies made on decentralization. But also there is the bigger angle of definitely looking at it in a wholesome manner as a continent. And from that perspective, I really wanted to drive home the issue of ministerial accountability or government accountability. Here they are giving us policies, saying they are committed to these policies of decentralization, and the local governments are really putting their best foot forward. But the support coming in from that angle, then it becomes questionable. So we need to do an advocacy pitch around the African Union on that, because the fact that African Union is about governments, the fact that African Union has this charter, we need to do step up advocacy for perhaps a dedicated desk or coordination point within the AU that is going to really give us focus. I know during the Urban Forum, the issue of the long-awaited operationalization of the High Council on Local Governments was on table. So we need that kind of follow-up in terms of advocacy, so that when the AU meets, when those governments sit and meet on their table, just like is happening now in UNGA, the African Union should be listening to the cities and sending the messages to filter down through the regional regs. And there, we should emphasize the point of collaboration, cooperation, and supporting the decentralized frameworks that are established by the governments themselves. So for me, I think assessment, yes, is good for us to provide the evidence-based advocacy, but we need to really, really invest in serious advocacy at the continental level, but also in our ways scaling it down in the different regions. I wanted to also kind of provide an alternative thought system about entry points, ministries on matters decentralization in a country. Fantastic. That is the principle, beautiful. But we know that with decentralization and with the independence of local governments, they've been able to mobilize themselves and form themselves into voices. We have the national platforms of associations, such as ourselves in East Africa, and down to the national level, each country has a voice. So you could use the two-winged approach. As you engage government, you can engage the local governments themselves through their chapter associations on these matters of decentralization, because increasingly, even if it is, as it seems, the continuous conversation at national level and regional level is that the two tend to meet. So as each handles their separate mandates, the advocacy can get a meeting point and platform in form of a national local cooperation dialogue to take forward matters concerning the deepening of decentralization and devolution within their respective settings. So I thought these are kind of my 2 points: stepping up advocacy at Africa chapter level, but also in a way building it up from bottom. We can start, we can do it, have a two-pronged approach where the sub-levels continue working up the advocacy, the assessments happen in those regions, and we get the data to feed into the advocacy that needs to get done. Over to you, Judy.
Paddy, maybe
Perhaps
jump.
I would come in because I can't see if Judy's in the room, but I quickly come in and maybe just give my 2 cents.
Yes, proceed, Paddy.
Okay, Dr. Juliet, thank you, I think, for the extensive information in terms of bringing the charter to the countries, and in terms of also the work that's around already with cities and local government. under that umbrella. I thought that, even when we were discussing it in Nairobi, one of the things we were saying is that there is so much information outlawed out there that sometimes doesn't filter down. And I think, just you sharing here is a demonstration of that as well. So to what extent do we also see a platform which is actually Pan-African? So the idea is not that the Pan-African platform would be Sub-Saharan focused, but that the transition as sort of a pilot or stepping stone, and I like how Gertrude came in to show the role of the sub-regional, is that it has a stepping stone within a structure of the LPSA. Now, the LPSA, and I'll let Jamie, if he can, with internet connection, comment on this, doesn't have an Africa group. It has a Sub-Saharan African group, but is also trying to rely on the other thematic groups that would talk about other issues. So, for instance, the women empowerment and equity group and gender equity group that is there. There's also a subgroup on sub-finance. There are also subgroups on democratization, for instance, democracy, and what that looks like in the local governance space. And so these sub-working groups would be interested points of entry, but because we're looking at it from inside of the LPSA, where we're sitting, where we're housed today. So to what extent do we use the structure we have today to build onto a Pan-African network? But indeed, stepping onto a Pan-African network would take care of all the sensitivities and all that is required from engagement from an African Union level to be much more inclusive than Sub-Saharan Africa. And I think we can indeed, with your recommendations that have come through, work out that. But we also feel that some of these assessments could be useful for us. And so maybe it's something that we have to actively see within the Sub-Saharan group. How do we engage and see what assessments have been done? And maybe a question which is difficult for you to answer here is where the gaps, because I'm sure even within the structure with government, with cities and local government, there are some gaps, as Gertrude has also shared with us, both in Nairobi when she was with us, but also today. What are those gaps, and how does then the Pan-African network and its transition body help to fill up those gaps so that we're useful for the work that is happening at the level of the UCLG, but also for the African Union at the national level, and for those experts that would be part of this body of influence and as such. So looking forward, I think, to having a detailed conversation, because that would really be needed as we move forward. Thank you.
Excellent presentation there, Paddy there. I don't know whether there was any other comments. Did Yusuf make it to speak as I was changing my devices?
Sylvia has shared a comment. Judy, if you can see
Okay.
that.
Let me just look through. I can see we have a comment from Paddy, actually from Sylvia. My comment was on the need to contextualize the assessments of decentralization, given that decentralization is varied across countries in Africa, and we are looking at contextualizing decentralization. That is very well noted, and I think we're going to incorporate that when we begin the work on the assessment. So that's very well noted, Sylvia. Thank you very much, Sylvia. Yusuf, I didn't see your comment. Did you want to? Uchi says he was. Did you have a comment from Nigeria, Dominic? So if not, can
I'm sorry.
Yes,
hello. I'm sorry,
Dominic.
I came very late, but the contribution had been really very useful on decentralization of some certain, can I say, resources, which can be even human resources, natural resources, in order to reach the grassroots at the local level, and also take care of how it's being distributed, very equal. It makes a lot of sense because most of the people are being disadvantaged, marginalized because of certain things. Could be tribe, And such a wonderful organization coming on board, emphasizing and campaigning for such, I really appreciate and ask for more collaboration. So thank you.
Thank you, Dominic. And I think because we also had made a request, I don't know if we found you here already. My other proposal would be that since we have contacts, if you can give us your emails and Lima can actually put that down. We could actually, after this, also share maybe a request. If you have programs that are running, instead of actually starting again or duplicating or inventing the wheel, we could begin embedding ourselves into programs that are actually working and seeing to it that they actually build into the assessments. They also build into the reports that we should be making on matters around data and evidence. So thank you, Dominic, for that. If we don't have any other, can we jump to the last one? Lima, do you have any other hand? I'm sorry, today I am not able to see.
No, that's right. All the attendees, we will have access to your email, so we can follow up right away. So not necessary, it's not required to send the emails. We will have access to it. I think you have covered everything. The only other thing is I'll be sharing the registration link for the next meeting in the chat box. So that's the only thing I have.
Okay, good. So can we then say, Jenny, I would like to see if you have anything on membership, because Ka was supposed to take this up.
So thanks so much. Let me, maybe there are a few thoughts on the previous conversation that came to mind. So if you give a preacher the microphone, expect a sermon, as the saying goes. Just to address the regional, whether the region should be Sub-Saharan or include North Africa. We are considering setting up a working group for Middle East and North Africa. And because there are certain regional issues that play more strongly within that region, that should not preclude the Sub-Saharan Africa Working Group from potentially shaping itself into a Pan-African working group or using it as a stepping stone for a Pan-African organization that also includes North Africa. There's no reason not to have that overlap if there is reason for that. I do want to maybe make a kind of challenge or put a few ideas out there in terms of the process of elevating the debate, because I even though I'm very excited that that the UN is paying attention to this issue, I've never come across a country that has said, let's do decentralization because the UN says it's a good idea. And so I think there are a lot of organizations that are really good at going to New York and talking about that. But I'm wondering if our space is better served by focusing on country level and within region conversations and sub-regional conversations. And again, even with the African Union, I'm not quite sure, you know, both the UN and African Union are clubs of national government. I'm ultimately, of course, they're the gatekeepers of deciding on decentralization, but I'm not quite sure if they're the obvious starting point. Just to keep it in the back of our minds, do we really need the approval of a club of national governments to tell us that subnational government have a meaningful role to play? And is that the venue where we're going to get the most traction for country level changes? I'm not sure it is. In terms of where I think maybe where I'd like to everyone to think a bit about how could the Africa Working Group elevate the debate? I appreciate that there are a number of tools out there. there is, for instance, a global data set on subnational finance done by OECD with UCLG and others. But if memory serves me, there are only a handful of African countries included in that data set. Because the data is not available on subnational finances, particularly not subnational finance by function, in virtually none of the countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. So would working together there with partners such as OECD and UCLG and others, would we be able to complement the existing data because we have access to a wider network of partners? Plus, we might be able to deepen the methodology because the data that is being collected is not local government level data, but is kind of total of all local governments in a country, which tells you very little about how subnational finances are distributed. Likewise, one thing that came up in Nairobi, and I'd like to emphasize, was perhaps that even though UN Habitat and UCLG and others are talking about localizing the SDGs, if I ask a simple question, for instance, what is the enrollment, elementary school enrollment and elementary school spending by local government? How many countries in Africa do we have data for on that simple question, right? Because if you don't have data on localization results at the local level in a granular way, how can you tackle the issue if you don't know where the issue is? Right. So I do tend to think that there are some very clear areas where the process of bringing together evidence and being clear about what we're talking about may elevate the debate on the issue of the nature of governance institutions. The colleague referred to the City Alliance UCLG Africa assessment. I was struck that that there are countries on the top of that list that don't, by the global definitions of the UN and IMF and others, are actually not local governments. There might be locally elected bodies, but they don't have their own officers. They don't have their own administrative apparatus separate from the central government. So there's some important effort needed to make sure we're very clear and very objective in assessing the nature of local governance institutions. And again, I think that's where, if we're working together across academia and practitioners, central government, local government, I think we can be a voice there. Simply because if I look around, we all believe decentralization and localization are important, but when we ask the simple question, how many local governments are there in Africa? What is the right? The answer is 11,500, roughly. France has more local governments than all of Africa combined. How many locally elected representatives are there in Africa? We don't have an answer. The number is simply unknown. Obviously, if we believe in local democracy, that is a key question to be answered. So I would encourage us to continue thinking about some of the places where the expertise that the network could bring together could actually bring evidence to the table that would allow us to truly elevate the debate, so that when we do go to New York or to Addis, African Union, that we can actually not just say this is important, but actually put some data behind what is important and what concretely should be different. Those would be some thoughts that came up as I was listening to the conversation. Hopefully that doesn't derail too much. Specifically on the membership issue, one of the things that LPSA is contemplating doing is expanding our membership portal so that LPSA members can, rather than just subscribe to a newsletter, is actually create a little bit of a profile for themselves that says who they are, what their interests are, and so forth. So that, for instance, if you are a interested in, let me say, fiscal decentralization or subnational PFM, that rather than asking the co-chairs or someone at the LPSA secretariat, do you know someone, you can actually look through the directory of LPSA members and find other members who have shared interests or who might be able to give you information that you can approach directly through a membership portal. So that is something we are contemplating. And that obviously would serve as a useful basis also for a Panda if that moves forward. Hopefully that addressed some of the issues that you wanted raised, Judy. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Jamie. I'm happy that I actually asked you to speak. And a very good way to also begin opening our mind on exactly where does the expertise lie. So making us just being keen on even the way we move when we take the next steps. Where do we go? Not only to look at organizations because of the name, but where is the real issue, number one? Where can we get the data, number two? But also, where does this expertise lie? So thank you for that, Jamie. And on membership, yes, I think it would be good to expand the membership, include the profiles, but also do we need additional expertise, for example, in the room, maybe as we move to the next one, how do we have those already who are members here just preach the good news, especially to institutions and the people that we know are doing something on decentralization. So if there is no other question, I can see we have about, am I right? We have about 5 minutes or 3 minutes. Can I ask for any other business before we conclude? I don't see a hand up. Any other business? Paddy, anything else to add? None. Okay, Lima, any logistical announcement that we have, maybe?
I think we're good. The registration link for the next meeting is shared in the chat box. Yeah, and that's about it. I hope most of us can join in the upcoming session too.
Do we have a date?
Yes, it's on the 12th of December.
Aha, very good. And what's the topic? I think there's a specific topic, or we'll share it in the emails.
Yes, yes.
Thank you. So I would like to encourage all of us to look at the website also, decentralization.net, for the report, actually a draft report of the last workshop. Although we are going to have another comprehensive report on it, I think it will be uploaded the moment it's finalized. Other than that, I have nothing more to say. Jamie, anything else, or do we close?
Nothing from my end. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you very much all for joining. Let's look out for the next meeting coming up in December. I don't think you want to miss. Lima and Jackie, who are not able to join us today, will be able to share the link so that you can register in good time. Thank you for your contributions, and we are going to share our discussions also in the website. Thank you very much, and have a good week.